It started out as a way to get away. I'd been working long hours in the city, stuck in traffic, stuck behind monitors, stuck in everything. I found the listing for the cabin on a hunting forum. It looked decent enough. 2 photos, both taken probably a decade ago, said it was a real old logging cabin from the 1930s, set back in some private timberland up in the hills. No address, just GPS coordinates. The guy renting it only accepted payment in cash, mailed to a P.O. box. I figured it was all part of the charm. I left on a Thursday morning, packed the truck with gear, food, a couple coolers, and my rifle. The GPS coordinates took me up into the mountains past the last stretch of paved road, then down a dirt trail that narrowed the deeper I went. It was a strange trail, like it hadn't been used in years, but it wasn't overgrown either. It wound through thick trees and dipped into a gully, then climbed again. No signs.
No gates.
No houses. Just woods. The trail finally opened into a small clearing where the cabin sat. It looked about like I expected, small, 1-room, wood planks weathered gray. A rusted stovepipe poked out of the roof. There was a pile of firewood already stacked, which was nice, and the front door was unlocked. Inside was just a cot, a table, a stove, and a few shelves with old cans of food and a coffee tin full of nails. Primitive but solid. I spent that afternoon unloading the truck, stacking food, and checking out the area. There was a stream down behind the cabin, and I shot a few targets I'd set up on some stumps. I didn't see a single person or vehicle all day. No cell service either, which I expected. I cooked dinner over the fire, drank a couple beers, and felt more relaxed than I had in years. It was quiet, not silent, but quiet in that deep woods way. Wind in the trees, birds, and the occasional snap of a branch. It wasn't until just after sundown that I noticed something strange. I was sitting on the porch, watching the sky dim, when I heard a sound that didn't quite fit. It wasn't an animal call or a bird. It was like a soft murmur, low, steady, like someone whispering. I thought maybe it was the wind cutting through some rocks or branches, but it didn't change with the gusts. It stayed steady, just low murmuring, way off in the trees. I stood and looked toward the woods, but it was too dark to see much. I waited, listened. Eventually, it stopped. I figured it was just my imagination, or maybe some weird trick of sound bouncing around the valley. That night, I slept light. The cot wasn't comfortable, and every creak in the wood or gust of wind woke me. I didn't hear the murmuring again, but I couldn't shake it. The next morning, I got up early, made some coffee, and walked the trail I came in on. Except it wasn't there. I stood where the path should have been. I had driven down it just yesterday. I remembered every curve, every dip, but now the trees were thick and untouched. No track marks.
No flattened grass.
No signs of a trail at all. I pushed into the woods for a while, thinking I was off by a few feet, but nothing, just dense forest. I went back to the cabin, pulled out the GPS, and rechecked the coordinates. They were right where I was. I walked around the clearing, tried different directions. I even used the compass, trying to head due north like I had when I came in. But the woods didn't open. Every way looked the same, endless trees. I didn't panic, not at first. I figured I'd just lost the trail. Maybe it was hard to spot from this direction. I marked the cabin on my GPS and kept trying. 2 hours later, I circled back to the cabin without meaning to. My boots were muddy, and I was sweating hard despite the cool air. That night, I built a bigger fire and left it burning into the dark. The murmuring came back, this time closer. I stood by the fire with my rifle in hand and listened. It never got loud, but it felt deliberate, like it circled me, just out of sight. I walked the perimeter with my flashlight, heart racing. Nothing. No eye shine, no tracks, just sound. Then silence again. On the third day, I tried to bushwhack straight north, hoping I'd hit a road or a cut line. I packed a day's worth of food and set out early. I walked for 6 hours. Trees, gullies, rocks, more trees. No road, no trail. I followed the GPS back to the cabin again, defeated. I started conserving food that evening. I had plenty, but it wasn't endless. The fourth day, I climbed a ridge behind the cabin to try and get a view. From the top, I should have seen the valley and the road I came in on. Instead, all I saw were trees, thick green everywhere, like I was in the middle of a forest that stretched for 100 miles. By day 5, I was on edge. The murmuring came every night now. Not loud, but consistent. Never any words. Just a low, steady whispering, like dozens of people talking far off, all at once. No pattern.
No rhythm.
Just sound. I didn't sleep much anymore. I tried everything. I marked trees. I tied cloth to branches. I started fires to try and signal for help. Nothing. The sky stayed clear. No planes. No smoke visible past the trees. I began to realize no one was looking for me because no one knew exactly where I was. I hadn't told anyone about the exact location, just that I was going out for a few days. I figured I'd be back Sunday night. Now it was Tuesday. On day 7, I hiked from sunrise to dusk in a new direction. South this time. Still nothing. I rationed my food again that night, tried to stay calm. The fire crackled. The murmurs came. I sat with my back against the wall, holding the rifle. The whispering felt closer now. Still unseen, but nearer. I started to wonder if I'd gone in a circle somehow, that the road might be there, just hidden. So I retraced every step I could remember from the day I arrived. I even looked for my own tire tracks, oil drips, anything. But the ground was undisturbed. Even where I knew I had parked, nothing. It was like the road had never existed. The cabin started to feel different after that. Smaller, oppressive. I began noticing scratches in the wood, faint marks on the doorframe like something had clawed at it. I didn't know if they were old or if I just missed them before. I started keeping the door barred at night, though I didn't know what I was barring it against. Food ran lower. I stopped trying to hike out and focused on fishing the creek, setting traps, boiling bark for tea. I tried radio signals with my emergency beacon. No response. I started writing a journal in case I didn't make it. Anything to stay sane. The murmuring didn't stop. Sometimes I thought I could feel it in my chest, like a vibration more than a sound. It would fade just before dawn, every night. I began to dread nightfall. I stopped sleeping at all. On the 11th day, I woke to find footprints around the cabin. Bare feet, human. They circled the place several times. My rifle hadn't moved. The door was still locked, but something had been there. I stayed inside all that day. That night, I boarded the windows. I made the decision to leave on day 13. I didn't care about the GPS. I didn't care about getting back to the truck. I just picked a direction and went. I took only what I could carry. I hiked as long as I could, slept for short bursts, and moved again. I repeated that for 2 full days. On the 3rd day, I stumbled out onto gravel. It was a service road, old, overgrown, but real. I followed it. Eventually, I found a gate and a power line. Then, a mile past that, a ranger station. They gave me water and called a ride. I didn't tell them everything, just that I got lost, that I'd gone deeper than I meant to. When I looked back at the GPS coordinates, they pointed to a blank section of the map.
No cabin.
No trail. Nothing ever listed or built there. Just green. I don't know what I walked into, but I'll never go back. That cabin, whatever it was, is gone. Just like the road. Just like the trail. Just gone. And every so often, if I'm outside late at night, I swear I hear it again, the faintest sound just past the wind. Murmuring. The forecast hadn't said anything about a blizzard. I remember that clearly because I checked it twice before heading into the mountains that weekend. I was doing one of those solo getaways, trying to disconnect for a while, give myself a mental reset. I'd taken a few back roads deep into the mountains, aiming to reach a trailhead I'd been wanting to hike. My vehicle, a beat-up SUV, wasn't new, but it was reliable enough. Or so I thought. Somewhere around noon, the clouds started rolling in heavy, thick, low gray clouds. The wind picked up, temperature dropped fast, and within an hour, snow was falling hard. The road, unpaved, narrow, winding through tall pines, began to disappear beneath it. I slowed down, trying to navigate it, but the tires were already sliding. I started looking for a place to stop, maybe wait it out. No signal on my phone. GPS had gone dead hours before. Then the engine started to sputter. I coasted to the side, hoping I could let it rest and try again later. When I turned the key again, nothing. Just a low, sluggish grind. That's when I noticed how cold it was inside the car. The heat had stopped working when the engine died. Snow was stacking on the windshield. My breath came out in thick clouds. Panic threatened to rise, but I pushed it down. I needed to focus. I grabbed my pack and stepped out into the snow. The wind bit through my clothes. Visibility was already less than 50 feet. I looked around and saw what looked like a man-made trail breaking through the trees on the left. No signs, no markers, but it was distinct. I followed it, hoping it might lead somewhere, anything. I didn't have much time before I'd start losing body heat fast. I trudged through the deepening snow for what felt like 15, 20 minutes. Then, out of nowhere, I saw a shape in the trees, square, dark, half covered in snow. It was a cabin, one of those old, one-story log cabins. No smoke from the chimney.
No lights.
I walked up and knocked once out of habit, then tried the door. It was unlocked. The inside was dark, but it didn't feel recently used. Dusty, cold, but shelter was shelter. I shut the door behind me and stood in the stillness for a moment. It smelled of old wood and something metallic. There was a small stove in the corner, some stacked firewood, and a cot with a moth-eaten blanket. I lit a few candles I found in the cupboard and managed to get a fire going after enough struggle with matches and kindling. I stripped out of my wet layers, hung them by the stove, and wrapped myself in a blanket I found folded in a chest. Felt like I could finally breathe again. The wind howled outside, and snow pounded against the walls, but I was alive, dry, and warming up. Sometime after I dozed off in the cot, I heard footsteps, heavy ones, crunching snow. I sat up. The wind hadn't stopped, but the sound was different, intentional, coming toward the cabin. A man opened the door without knocking. Tall, mid-40s maybe, wearing a heavy coat and snow-caked boots. He looked surprised, but not alarmed. His eyes scanned the room, then landed on me. I got up and motioned toward the fire. He stood there a second longer, then nodded and stepped in, shutting the door behind him. He took off his gloves slowly, set them near the stove to dry. He sat across from me, on a stool beside the cot. His eyes kept coming back to me. I started to explain. Something about being stranded, the snow, the car, but he just sat there staring. After a long pause, he reached into a cupboard and pulled out a can of soup, opened it, and set it on the stove. Like he knew where everything was, like it was his place. He ate without offering me any, without saying anything. I wrapped myself tighter in the blanket, watching him. The fire crackled. The wind screamed outside. The man said nothing. Eventually, I lay back down, eyes still on him. I didn't sleep much. Every little sound, the shifting of his boots, the creak of the cabin, even his slow breathing, kept me wide awake. I kept telling myself he was probably just surprised, that this was his place, and I'd just gotten lucky finding it. But something felt off. When dawn finally came, light filtered in through the frosted window. I got up, pulling my jacket on and opening the door. The snow was piled high, but what stopped me wasn't the weather. My SUV was gone. The tracks in the snow were almost covered, but I could still make out tire marks. My vehicle had been moved sometime during the night, driven away. I turned around to look at the man, who was now stirring the fire like he'd been there all along. He looked up at me like nothing had happened, like I was the guest. I went out into the snow, yelling. I thought maybe I'd parked in the wrong spot. Maybe the snow was playing tricks on me. But there was only one way in and out, and my vehicle was gone. Back inside, the man had started cooking again. He didn't acknowledge me, didn't say a word. I sat by the stove trying to think. I didn't know this guy, didn't know what he wanted, but he hadn't hurt me, not yet. I waited until he stepped outside to get more wood. Then I checked his pack. No ID, no phone, nothing helpful, just a knife and some matches. The snow let up by the afternoon, and I made a decision. I packed my things, shoved a few supplies into my bag, and left. I didn't say a word to him, I didn't look back. I followed the tracks as far as I could. They led to a crossroad I hadn't seen the day before. Then they vanished. No sign of my SUV, just forest and silence. I hiked out the way I'd come in, retracing the trail in the snow. My legs were shaking. Every sound in the trees made me jump. I didn't stop moving. Not until I found a main road hours later and flagged down a snowplow. They called a ranger, then a tow. But when we went back up, there was no cabin. Just trees, no trail, no foundation, nothing. I still don't understand how that's possible. I remember every detail of that place. The stove, the cot, the man's boots by the fire. The ranger said maybe I got turned around. Maybe I imagined it. But I didn't imagine the cold. I didn't imagine the man. And I sure as hell didn't imagine that my car was gone. I never saw it again. Not the cabin, not the man, not the vehicle. And every winter since then, when the first snow falls, I see it all over again in my head. The cabin that shouldn't have been there, the man who acted like I was the one intruding, and that morning when I stepped out into the snow and realized I was alone. Really, truly alone. We bought the cabin in early September, just before the trees in the Appalachians started to turn. It was the kind of place I'd always imagined fixing up. Quiet, isolated, wrapped in pine and shadow, sitting up on a ridge with no visible neighbors. It hadn't been lived in for years, but it had strong bones and sat on a thick concrete foundation. The roof sagged slightly in the back, and the floorboards inside were warped from decades of mountain damp. But the frame was solid, and the land, 5 acres of it, was thick and wild and beautiful. We were in our 30s, with no kids and enough savings to take some time off work. The plan was to spend the fall and winter fixing it up, turn it into a vacation rental, or maybe live there half the year if we liked it enough. We didn't have any reason not to take the leap. No one warned us, and even if they had, we probably would have thought it was just small-town superstition. The first few weeks were quiet and filled with the kind of physical work that wears you down in a good way. We pulled out old insulation, ripped down rotting paneling, scrubbed mold off the stone fireplace, and set up a makeshift kitchen in what used to be a mudroom. The water line needed work, and there was no septic, but we had a compost toilet and ran a line from the spring up the hill for non-potable water. We slept on a mattress on the floor and took sponge baths in a metal tub. There were some odd details in the cabin that stuck with me. Scratches on the inside of one closet door, faint but clearly from fingernails. A heavy steel latch bolted onto the outside of the bedroom door, like it had once been used to lock someone in. In the crawl space, we found a couple of old mason jars with dead spiders floating in what smelled like vinegar. But none of it felt sinister at the time, just the leftovers of someone's strange life. We chalked it up to mountain eccentricities and kept working. The noises started about 3 weeks in. The first time, I thought it was just mice, maybe a raccoon. It sounded like scratching, light at first and only at night. It came from under the floor in the kitchen area mostly. We hadn't torn up that part yet, so the floor was still original. Old pine planks, dry and brittle, a little soft in places. I told myself it was normal. Old cabins have all kinds of wildlife living underneath. We'd seen signs of it already. A possum in the trash one morning, a snake skin under the porch, nests in the attic. We made a note to install wire mesh around the foundation and put it out of mind. But the sounds didn't stop. They changed. They got louder. The scratching turned into shuffling. Sometimes it sounded like dragging. Long, slow movements, almost like something heavy being pulled across dirt. It happened late at night, just as we were falling asleep. We'd lie there in the dark, the fire in the stove dying down, and there'd be the steady, deliberate noise from beneath us. Sometimes it would stop for hours and then start again just before dawn. I got up one night with a flashlight and went outside to check the crawl space. There was a small door around the back, held shut with a rusty latch. I pried it open and ducked in. The space was maybe 3 feet high, just enough to crouch. The dirt was packed hard and dry, with a few old cinder blocks scattered around and cobwebs thick as rope. I didn't see any animals. No tracks, no droppings, no sign of a den. Just a lot of dust and cold, still air. I told her it was nothing, just the house settling. But I didn't believe that. About a week later, I decided to start pulling up the floorboards in the kitchen. The boards were badly warped and needed replacing anyway, and I figured if there was anything under there, dead animals, old junk, maybe something rotting, I'd find it and deal with it. I started in the corner, near the wood stove. I used a pry bar to lift the first few boards. Nothing under them but dry dirt and a few beetles. But as I worked my way inward, something started to smell. Faint at first, damp and sour, like spoiled meat just beginning to turn. I lifted another board and saw it. A tin can, the kind you'd keep beans in. The label was half gone, but I could make out the word chili on it. It had been opened, and the inside was coated with something dried and black. Next to it was a plastic fork, the tines bent, and a scrap of what looked like torn fabric. Maybe part of a shirt. I kept pulling up boards. There were more cans, dozens, all opened, all empty. Some stacked neatly, others tossed aside. A few still had bits of food in them, green fuzz growing on top, thick with mold. There was a blanket rolled up under one joist, stiff with grime. Pile of wrappers, a rusted spoon, a cracked mirror with a piece of tape over one corner. Scratch marks in the dirt wall, long and deep. And then I saw the blood. It was smeared on the underside of one of the joists, still dark red, not completely dried. It looked fresh, not hours fresh, maybe a day or two, but not old. That's when I stopped. I crawled back out, stood in the cold kitchen with my gloves stained and my shirt soaked in sweat. The air inside suddenly felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I covered the hole with a sheet of plywood and nailed it down. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there, looking out the window at the trees. I told myself it had to be old. Someone had lived down there a long time ago. Maybe a drifter. Maybe the last owner was keeping someone down there. I didn't want to think too hard about it. I didn't want to start making connections that would unravel everything. That night, the noises didn't come from under the floor. They came from outside. At first, it sounded like someone stepping on dry leaves, slow and steady, moving through the brush behind the cabin. Then I heard something scrape along the wall. Not an animal.
Something taller.
Something dragging its hand or whatever along the siding. I didn't go outside. I stood there with a hammer in one hand and the flashlight in the other, listening. After maybe 15 minutes, the noise stopped. Silence came back so quickly, it made me wonder if I'd imagined it. The next morning, I found prints in the soft dirt near the back door. Bare feet, long toes, deep impressions. Too big for a kid, too narrow for a grown man. The kind of prints that shouldn't have been there, that couldn't be there logically. I decided we were leaving. She didn't argue. She'd heard the noises too. She'd seen my face when I came back in from under the house. We packed what we could, left the tools, left the food, drove down the mountain in silence. We stayed in a motel for 2 nights and didn't talk about it. I kept the keys in my pocket but didn't unlock the door again. A week later, I called a friend who lived nearby and asked him to check on the place. He went up with his dog, called me that afternoon. He said the back door was open, not broken into, just open. Inside, everything was overturned. The mattress we'd slept on was shredded. The contents of every cabinet dumped out. The plywood I'd nailed over the kitchen floor had been ripped up and thrown across the room. And the crawl space door was wide open. He said he didn't go inside. His dog refused to go near the house, just stood there growling, hackles up. We never went back. We sold the place as is to a guy who wanted hunting property and didn't care about the condition. We took a loss, signed the papers, and moved on. But I think about it all the time. I think about whoever or whatever was living down there, not just passing through, living, eating, scratching the dirt walls. I think about how long they were there. I wonder if they were kept there, or if they chose it. I wonder if they ever left. Sometimes I have dreams where I'm lying on the cabin floor again, and I can hear the boards creak under my back. And I know, without any doubt, that someone is lying just beneath me, on the other side of the wood, listening, waiting, and I wonder if they ever stopped. I remember the first time I saw the cabin. It was late September, the kind of weekend where the leaves were starting to fall, but the air still held some leftover warmth. We'd driven 5 hours to get there. Me, Luke, Aaron, and Josh, crammed into Luke's Subaru with all our hiking gear, sleeping bags, and enough food to last us 4 days. It was Erin's idea originally. She'd been there before, years ago, when she and Luke first started dating. Luke's family owned the place, an old wood cabin deep in the mountains, and they used it maybe once a year, usually for hunting. Most of the time, it sat empty. It wasn't anything fancy, just a boxy 2-bedroom cabin with dark wood siding and a big stone chimney. No electricity, no running water. There was a generator we could use for lights at night, but we only ran it in short bursts. There was an outhouse down a little trail to the left of the property and a shallow creek not far from that where we could fill up water bottles. Around back, maybe 30 feet from the cabin itself, was a locked shed. It was the only thing on the property that looked remotely secure. Thick padlock, chain around the handles, windows covered from the inside with something we couldn't see through. I remember asking Luke what was in it when we first unpacked. He just shrugged and said something about old tools and maybe a generator or two. Said his dad kept it locked all the time and didn't want anyone messing with it. None of us thought much of it after that. The first day was good. We unloaded, set up our sleeping pads inside, made dinner on a portable stove. That night, we lit a fire in the small pit outside and sat around it, drinking cheap beer and talking about the trails we wanted to hit. There was no cell service out there, nothing at all. You could walk for miles in any direction and not get a bar. The quiet was almost overwhelming at first. Just wind, the sound of the creek, and maybe a few birds off in the trees. By the second day, we'd done 10 miles on one of the longer loops. Came back sore and muddy, but happy. Felt good being away from everything. Simple, clean. The air smelled like pine and old leaves. The cabin was musty but dry. We boiled creek water for coffee and kept things tidy. At night, we played cards by lantern light. I could feel myself relaxing in a way I hadn't in a long time. But something about the shed kept tugging at me. I noticed it the second night. After the fire had died down and we were all getting ready to go inside, I looked over at it and felt this weird pull. It was probably nothing, but the way it just sat there, completely sealed off from the rest of the property, felt deliberate. Like it didn't belong to the cabin. Like it had its own purpose that had nothing to do with us. Later that night, after everyone else was asleep, I went out to pee and walked past it. The moon was high enough to see without a flashlight. The shed was silent. No noise inside, no smell. I stood there for a minute, looking at the lock, wondering why it was still so heavy on my mind. I walked back to bed and didn't mention it the next day. The third day is when things changed. It started normal enough. We did a shorter hike, ate lunch at a rocky overlook, took photos, joked around. But that night, after dinner, Josh got weird, quiet. We thought maybe he was just tired or coming down with something. He kept looking out the cabin window toward the shed, barely saying anything. Later, after we'd gone inside, I heard movement. I didn't think much of it. Maybe one of them went out to get firewood or take a piss. But the next morning, Josh wasn't there. At first, we figured he'd gone for a walk. He was known to get up early sometimes, head off alone for a bit to clear his head. But his boots were still inside. His pack too. So was his coat. The only thing missing was one of the flashlights and his lighter. We searched the woods for hours. No sign of him. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. Luke and I walked the road back toward the main trailhead for a mile before turning around. Aaron stayed at the cabin in case he came back. By the time we regrouped that afternoon, we were all on edge. It was Aaron who opened the shed. I didn't see her do it. I was out back checking the creek. When I got back, she was just standing there with the door half open, not saying anything. The lock was on the ground. She'd hit it with a rock until it broke. I should have stopped her. I know that now. Inside the shed, it was dark. No windows, just the open door letting in a shaft of light. Dust floated in the air. Smelled like dry wood, old metal, and something sour. Not rot, exactly. More like sweat and dampness that had soaked into things and never dried. There were shelves along the back wall, lined with old equipment, lanterns, tools, extension cords. But it was the table in the middle that made me stop. It was covered in photos, dozens of them, some pinned to a corkboard, others in plastic sleeves, some just scattered across the surface. They were of us. Some were clearly taken recently. Me chopping wood, Aaron crouched by the fire, Josh sitting on the porch. But others looked older. They showed us walking through the woods. One of me tying my boot laces, one of Luke brushing his teeth. None of us had noticed anyone else around. And the angles of the photos weren't random. They were close, focused, like someone had been watching us through a long lens from somewhere nearby. Some of the photos had timestamps in the corners. Most were from the last 3 days. A few from years earlier. They were labeled in pen with names and dates, none of which made sense. Some names we didn't recognize. All the handwriting looked the same. There was more too. A notebook filled with page after page of scrawled writing. Mostly dates, weather reports, names we didn't recognize, lists of gear. And notes like, female, mid-20s, woke up twice during the night, avoided outhouse. Male, approximate 30, moved toward shed 1:27 a.m., retreated, suspect hesitation. Decide by end of day 3, waiting. I started to feel sick. Erin was still just standing there, looking down at the photos. Her mouth was slightly open, like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. I turned to leave and noticed something on the floor in the corner. An old mattress. Thin, stained, flattened from use. Next to it, a small cooler, closed. I opened it. Inside were protein bars, water bottles, a roll of duct tape, and a small digital camera. I turned it on. The memory card was still inside. I scrolled through the photos. The most recent one was from the night before. It showed Josh, standing in front of the shed with a flashlight in one hand. The next picture was blurry. The one after that was of his back, walking into the trees. That was the last one. We packed up and left that afternoon. Took everything we could carry and hiked the 10 miles back to the car instead of sleeping another night. I didn't sleep that night anyway. I kept picturing Josh, alone in the woods, maybe dragged off somewhere, maybe worse. We went to the police, filed a missing persons report, showed them the camera, showed them the notebook. They took it all. They said they'd look into it. We didn't hear anything for a week. Then they called us back. They'd searched the shed. Found nothing out of the ordinary, they said. No photos, no notebook, no food. Said the shed was empty except for some old tools and fishing gear. Said maybe we were confused. Maybe we'd imagined it or gotten turned around. Said they'd found some animal tracks not far from the cabin. That Josh probably wandered off and got lost. It happens, they told us. But we knew. We hadn't imagined it. There were too many details, too many photos, too much intent behind everything we saw in that shed. I never went back to the cabin. Neither did Aaron or Luke. The family sold it the next summer. I don't know who bought it. Don't want to know. What gets me is how close it all was. How easy it was to miss. That shed sat behind the cabin the whole time we were there. We passed it every day. It was just part of the background. We laughed, made dinner, slept soundly while someone was out there, taking pictures, watching, waiting. Sometimes I think Josh knew. Maybe he felt it first. Maybe that's why he went out there that night. Maybe he found something he wasn't supposed to, and whoever had been watching decided it was time. I think about the notes in that book, the way it described us like test subjects. Decide by end of day 3, like there was some plan already in motion, like Josh was chosen. I wonder how many other names were in those photos. I wonder if any of them ever came back. We told the police everything. They didn't believe us. Or maybe they did, but didn't want to deal with it. Either way, no one ever found Josh. And I never forgot what we saw in that shed. That someone had been watching us the entire time. Closer than we ever realized. And I think they're still out there, waiting for the next group to come stay. I rented the cabin because I needed to get away. I'd hit a wall with my writing, and the city noise was making it worse. I thought a week alone in a quiet place would help. Somewhere cold and empty where the distractions would all fall away. I found the listing online. an older cabin tucked into a hillside in northern Vermont. Remote but maintained, no close neighbors, decent Wi-Fi, a fireplace, a big table to spread out on. It seemed perfect. I drove up early one morning in January. The sky was dull and the road slick with packed snow. I had to drive the last few miles slow, weaving through narrow curves with trees pressing in on both sides. By the time I pulled into the gravel driveway, it was already getting dark. The cabin was simple, just one story, with weathered boards, a wide porch, and a chimney puffing smoke like someone had been there recently. I figured the property manager had come up to get the place ready. Inside, everything looked just like the pictures. Stone fireplace, pine floors, wide windows looking out into the woods. There were 2 bedrooms, though I only planned to use one. A small kitchen, a creaky bathroom, and a set of stairs leading to a dry crawlspace below. I noticed the crawlspace door had a deadbolt on it, which seemed a little odd, but I didn't give it much thought at the time. I unpacked, turned up the heat, and sat down at the table with my laptop. For the first time in months, I felt like I might actually get some writing done. The first night was uneventful, cold, quiet, still. I slept hard. The next morning, I stepped outside to breathe the air and stretch, and that's when I saw the boot prints. They were on the porch right outside the front door. Heavy prints, deep in the snow, leading to the steps but not away from them. At first I thought I must have made them myself, but they didn't match the tread of my boots, and they were too large. I looked around, but the woods were empty. It had snowed lightly overnight, and if the prints had been made before that, they should have been covered. These were fresh. I stood there for a while, just staring at them. Then I told myself the only thing that made sense. Someone from the property management team must have come by, maybe to check on the pipes or top off the firewood. They hadn't knocked or said anything, but maybe they didn't want to bother me. I shook it off. I wrote most of the day. Felt good to work, to focus. Around dusk, I made dinner and watched the trees outside grow darker and flatter, until the forest was just a black wall behind the windows. I turned on the porch light. Later, as I sat by the fire with a glass of whiskey, I heard something. It was faint, a dry, almost wet sound, like something catching in a throat. It came from the hallway near the bedrooms. I froze. I waited. The sound came again, like a cough. A man's cough. I got up, heart pounding, and checked both bedrooms. Empty. I opened the bathroom. Nothing. I stood in the hall for a long time, holding my breath, but the sound didn't come again. Maybe it had been the pipes. The cabin was old. Maybe it had been the wind. I didn't know, but I didn't sleep much that night. I kept listening over and over to every creak of the boards. In the morning, I found more boot prints, this time on the back porch, leading from the woods. Again, there were no prints going back. I followed them with my eyes until they disappeared into the snow beneath the trees. I didn't go out there. I just stood at the door, hand on the knob, trying to make sense of it. Inside, a few things felt off. A coffee mug I didn't remember using was sitting in the drying rack. Plate was in the sink, wet. I tried to convince myself I'd done those things and forgotten. Maybe I'd used them late at night. Maybe I was just tired. I told myself that again and again, but I kept seeing those boot prints, fresh and deep. By the third night, I was double-checking the locks on the doors and windows. I pushed a chair under the doorknob before I went to bed. I still hadn't written much more. I felt watched. Every time I passed a window, I looked out at the trees, waiting to see movement, to see someone standing just beyond the reach of the light. I heard the cough again, louder this time, closer. It was just before dawn. I was still awake, lying in bed with the covers pulled up. The cough was right below me under the floor. I got out of bed, crept to the hallway, and opened the door to the crawlspace stairs. The air that came up was cold and stale, like wet stone. I stared down into the dark, waiting to hear another sound, but nothing came. I locked the deadbolt and walked away. That morning, I decided to leave. I didn't even pack. I just grabbed my laptop and a few things and loaded up the car. The sun was up, but the woods still felt dead. I turned the car around and started to back out of the driveway. That's when I saw something out of the corner of my eye, movement in the side window of the cabin. a shape pulling back from the glass. I braked. I sat there, hand frozen on the gear shift, eyes on that window. Nothing moved again. The curtain was still. I looked at the porch, at the door I'd locked behind me. The chair I'd wedged under the knob was tipped over. It hadn't been when I left. I pulled the car forward, slowly, then stopped again. Something in me didn't want to leave without knowing. I backed up, turned the engine off, and walked back to the cabin. Inside, the air was still warm. The fire had gone out, but the smell of burned wood was fresh. I walked slowly, checking each room again. Everything looked normal. Nothing seemed touched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside while I was gone. I opened the crawlspace door and stood at the top of the stairs. The light bulb above the steps was dim and yellow. I flicked it on. The crawlspace was low, with a dirt floor and thick wooden beams. There were boxes along the far wall, old paint cans, a broken chair, some folded tarps. I stepped down one stair at a time. It was cold and close. The ceiling was barely above my head. I crouched, shining my flashlight into the corners. Nothing. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw it. A pile of blankets and plastic bags tucked behind the furnace. An empty can of beans. A dirty spoon. A stack of folded clothes. Someone had been living down here. I backed up, heart pounding, nearly tripping on the steps. I slammed the door shut, locked the bolt again, and stood there shaking. I didn't know how long they'd been there. Maybe since before I arrived. Maybe they'd come in after. But someone had been living in the crawlspace right under me. I drove away without looking back. I got to the nearest town and called the property owner from a gas station. I told them what I found. They said they'd check it out. I didn't wait to hear what they found. I just drove home. A few days later, I got a message from the owner. They'd gone up there with the police. The crawlspace was empty. The blankets, the clothes, all gone. No signs of forced entry anywhere in the cabin. The only thing they'd found was a small hole at the back of the crawlspace, hidden behind the furnace, opening into a narrow passage that led into the hillside. It was just wide enough for someone to crawl through. I haven't gone back. I don't think I ever will. I don't know who was living under that cabin. I don't know if they were just looking for shelter or if it was something worse. I don't care. I don't need answers. I just know I wasn't alone up there, and I never really was.